So the New Zealand company is really critical to the story, and that's a company that's founded in London in May 1839, a successor to the New Zealand Association that's established 2 years earlier in 1837. And the New Zealand company is dedicated to the systematic colonisation of New Zealand, and it's based on the theories and ideas developed by Edward Gibbon Wakefield. And he develops these ideas about systematic colonisation while he's in prison. He's sentenced to 3 years in prison for imprisoning abducting a 15-year-old heiress, Ellen Turner, along with his brother, William Wakefield. And so he develops these ideas about colonisation, and a key to that is what he calls the sufficient price, and that is that land should be sold to intending migrants and colonists at a price sufficient to ensure that only wealthier members of society could afford those lands, but that it would also subsidise the migration of the labouring classes. So what the New Zealand company is founded on is this kind of idealised vision of the English class structure that they were hoping to transplant to the other side of the world. And Wakefield gets a lot of support for this idea. Some very influential members of British society get behind the company, that they establish interest in the company, and they have begun to sell lands in England before they've even acquired any in New Zealand, and that's a real issue in terms of what unfolds subsequently.
And
so the New Zealand company is a really critical part of the story. It's founded in 1839, following an early New Zealand Association in 1837, and this is really colonisation by a private company. They have they gain a monopoly right to acquire large areas of land for Māori and sell it to settlers for the colonisation of New Zealand. The problem is they sell lands before they've even acquired any, and that creates major tensions throughout on both sides of the Cook Strait, really.
who was behind the New Zealand company?
Edward Gibbon Wakefield is a key figure in this, and he is imprisoned for abducting a 15-year-old heiress, Ellen Turner, along with his brother William Wakefield. They're sentenced to prison for 3 years. During his time in jail, he develops this idea about what he calls systematic colonisation, and that's based on his theory of a sufficient price, which is that land should be sold to intending migrants at a price that was sufficient to ensure that only the richer members of society could afford to buy those lands, while it would also subsidise the migration of the labouring classes. So it was intended to kind of replicate an idealised version of the English class system in a way.
And so they came out here to Aotearoa in the 1830s, and they began, was it around the Wellington, the Nelson area first?
Yeah, so William Wakefield is dispatched on the Tory soon after the company is founded. He arrives, identifies the Cook Strait region as one that the New Zealand company would be interested in acquiring, and he enters into a number of deals. One with Te Raupaha, Ngāti Toa and others, a Kapiti, another in Wellington, and another in Queen Charlotte Sound. And these land deals purport to sell to the New Zealand company all of the lands between Moko and northern Taranaki down to the Huranui River in North Canterbury, an area estimated at 20 million acres, so nearly a third of the entire country, that Wakefield has supposedly purchased from a handful of rangatira who represent a tiny fraction of those with customary interest in those lands. And I mean, there are also major issues in terms of the understandings that the parties had of these transactions and what they meant.
In the 1830s, what do you think Māori understanding of land purchase was?
Well, the notion of the permanent alienation of land is not part of Māori tikanga. That's a foreign idea, and Māori understandings of land transactions at this time would be, in terms of those entered into with Europeans, would be that they were entering into something more akin to the establishment of an ongoing relationship between the two parties where they agreed to share those lands and resources for the mutual benefit of all. And that was kind of consistent with customary ideas of a tuku or gift of the lands, which didn't imply a permanent alienation and didn't imply that the other party acquired exclusive interest in those lands. So there are these two competing ideas as to what these deals were about, and it's sometimes asked, when did Māori understand what a land sale was? And that's not really the key question. The key question really is when were Europeans in a position to impose the idea of what a land sale was on Māori? Because Māori had their own tikanga and their own value systems around land and what it meant and how it was shared between parties.
When were they?
Well, this, in terms of the Crown and Pākehā being in a position to impose their will, this takes some time, and it's certainly, in 1840 or even in 1843, they're not really in a position to do that, and that is one of the factors behind what happens at Wairau in 1843, these competing understandings of what has been entered into.
Can you paint us a picture of, what the Cook Strait might have looked like at that time, Māori and new settlers, whalers?
Yeah, so late 1830s, a number of whalers had migrated to the region, to Cloudy Bay, to elsewhere in the northern South Island, and also, of course, to Kapiti and elsewhere in the lower North Island. And they often formed working relationships with the Māori communities that they lived with. They would marry Māori wives and establish those relationships with those communities, and they were quite small in number, and often the hosts found those whalers quite useful for various purposes, including facilitating trade and acquisition of muskets and other things and so on. So this is not organised colonisation, this is not systematic colonisation, it's a much more informal kind of relationship between the parties where most of the time they kind of work out ways to get along with one another because they have a mutual interest in that and they both see benefits from that relationship. But what happens after 1840 with the New Zealand Company is on an entirely different scale. There you have thousands and thousands of settlers flooding into the area, and that's a completely new dynamic.
Yeah, what would the population have been around those times, and when did it flip?
Well, in terms of the Pākehā population, so Nelson in the mid-1840s, I think, would have been several thousand Pākehā, and relatively quickly the local Māori population are outnumbered. So certainly, by the late 1840s, Pākehā were in the majority in the area, and probably a similar dynamic also in the lower North Island.
Why the Wairau? Why were settlers so keen on the Wairau?
So Wairau was connected to the establishment of the New Zealand Company's second settlement, which was Nelson, and that is selected by Arthur Wakefield, who is sent to scout a location for their second settlement after Wellington. He selects Nelson in Tasman Bay, and once again, before those lands have even been identified, they've been sold in London. And the New Zealand Company's plan for the Nelson settlement is to be a 221,000 acre settlement. So a thousand sort of parcels of land. Each settler would acquire 150 acres of rural lands, 50 acres of suburban, and 1 town acre, so 201 acres. And then Māori would be insured 1/10 on top of that, so that the company required 221,000 acres for that scheme to work. They soon realised or took the view that they didn't have sufficient good quality agricultural lands in Tasman Bay or even Golden Bay for that. The settlers arrive from February 1842 onwards. They've purchased their lands in good faith from the New Zealand Company. They start clamouring to have access to those lands, where are the lands that they've bought from the company. At the end of 1842, surveyors for the New Zealand Company explore the Wairau district. They come back to Nelson and report that they've found 200,000 acres of extremely good quality agricultural lands, and it seems like the solution to all of the New Zealand Company's problems. There's just one problem with that, which is that the customary owners of those lands have no conception that they've sold those lands, and this is the root of the problem.
Te Rauparaha was a double signee of the Te Tiriti. What was likely the reason he signed it twice?
Well, it was said that a strong motivating factor for Te Rauparaha in signing Te Tiriti was that he believed that this would ensure his ownership of all of the lands that he claimed to have conquered in the Cook Strait region, both in the North Island and South Island, that the land guarantee in Article 2 of Te Tiriti would ensure that those lands remained with him, and that was a principal motivation for him.
So he would have been even more confident that his lands were his?
Yes, well, from his agreement to Te Tiriti, he believed that the Crown had in turn promised him ownership of those lands, along with, Tineranga Tiratanga, the right to exercise his chiefly authority over that area.
Let's just move on to a couple of descriptions before we jump into what happened at Wairau. But can you describe for us Henry Thompson? What was his job, his character, his manner and his appearance?
Henry Thompson was the police magistrate for Nelson. He was one of the few Crown officials in the region. He was also the protector of Aborigines for the area. So, ironically, one of his explicit tasks was to protect the interests of Māori in that area, and that role had been established so that somebody working for the Crown would have an explicit responsibility to look out for Māori interests, to advocate for Māori, and Thompson was supposed to do that at the same time that he was police magistrate. And he, in terms of his character, nearly all of those who described him as a very volatile and short-tempered character. That there are many stories of him flying into a rage over often quite trivial incidents. And in terms of the kind of delicate world of Māori and Pākehā relationships in the area in the early 1840s, he was possibly one of the worst possible figures to take on such a role.
What did he look like?
I'm not sure what he looked like.
Well, what age was he around?
He was quite young. He was only 28, I think.
And we've heard about some of the Wakefield brothers, but in this instance, can you describe who is Arthur Wakefield?
Arthur Wakefield is another brother of Edward. He serves in the Royal Navy. He leaves at the end of 1841, where he feels his progress in the Navy has come to a halt, really, and he takes on the position of the company's agent in Nelson after selecting the site for that settlement, and so he has responsibility for managing the company's affairs in Nelson. And in that role, he is really one of the prime targets for the settler agitation, demanding access to the lands that they had purchased from the company. So he's sort of in the gun in terms of the need to find the lands that settlers had been promised.
Arthur Wakefield's brothers were both imprisoned. They were criminals. Did he have the same reputation, or was he different?
It's hard to say. He'd served in the Royal Navy as an officer, so I think in that respect, he probably had a greater degree of respectability in a way.
So we're 1839. I wondered if you could set the scene in Te Raukawa Moana. How's that You okay with that, Dean?
Yeah.
Just as it is now, it's very borderline.
Yeah.
Can we do one on William Wakefield as well, or with the Wakefields?
Edward or William?
William.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
And
Sorry.
and Edward.
Yeah, I don't know what to say about William, brother.
But what his role was.
Yeah.
The fact that what his
Okay,
role in Wellington was he was the senior. He was senior to. He was pulling the strings from Wellington.
Yeah,
would it be?
yeah.
No, just.
Yeah, and Arthur was the kind of junior partner in his junior brother role. Would you say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was Arthur older? Did you say, or William?
William was the older.
I think William would be the older,
Yes.
because he was the one who went to the slammer with his brother, so
Yeah.
yeah. Arthur was probably too young.
Oh, yeah, glass on the front. Shit, did it slide off? I don't think there's much we can probably do about that anyway, is there?
Just keep
Not
going.
really, and some of it's been consistent, so I think the post will be able to take a bit of that up.
These IDs ever have a music text? I can't remember.
There's some, but we don't.
If it leads into a drama beat,
Yeah.
Yeah.
They might have to introduce them. Anyway.
it is what it is, eh?
It's a chainsaw.
One of my favourite sayings, brother.
Plus
Already got it.
Okay.
okay, how are we looking? Okay.
In the scheme of things, who was Colonel William Wakefield?
So William Wakefield was the New Zealand Company's principal agent in Wellington, and as such, he was senior to Arthur in the scheme of things, and a key figure in terms of the company's relationship, both with the settlers here and also with the company representatives in London.
And they had a brother in England, Edward Gibbon Wakefield. Can you describe him?
Well, Edward Gibbon Wakefield is kind of the brains behind the New Zealand Company scheme and develops these ideas around systematic colonisation and efficient price and so on. And he's very influential in terms of securing support and funding for the New Zealand Company, and their early settlements are well supported, and they receive backing from very influential members of high society in England.
And so just Te Raukawa Moana in 1839, what was the 1839 purchase agreement between the New Zealand Company and Ngāti Toa? Like, what was it for and what was the understanding?
So the deed is signed in October 1839 between William Wakefield, Te Raupaha and other rangatira of Ngāti Toa, and it purports to convey to the New Zealand Company all of the lands between northern Taranaki down to North Canterbury, basically, around 20 million acres, 1/3 of the country. And in return, Ngāti Toa receive guns, ammunition, various tools and utensils that represent a tiny fraction of obviously the land that the company claims to purchase via this deed.
What do you think the understanding, Māori understanding of that purchase deed would have been at the time?
Well, the notion of a land sale is foreign to Māori tikanga. The way that Māori were more likely to understand the transaction is that they are forging a relationship with the newcomers, agreeing to share the lands and resources on them between the two parties. And so in that sense, not a permanent alienation of the lands, but the forging of a relationship which is kind of contingent on both parties being satisfied with that relationship. And that's a different way of thinking about the transaction. It's not a one-off real estate deal, it's about the relationships between the parties.
And I guess taking into account the way that Māori actually used the land in the first place, which was very nomadic.
Yeah, so it becomes sort of evident later on, especially when the New Zealand Company's claims to the land begin to be challenged, that they are very much influenced by what's called the wastelands theory, which is this idea that Māori and other Indigenous peoples don't really own lands if they don't cultivate or expend labour on those lands. So if you think about the way Māori used land at the time, large areas of land could be used for hunting purposes or left fallow, or a whole different way of using those lands. And the idea of, in the view of the New Zealand Company, that meant that those lands weren't validly held by them. And a New Zealand Company representative, when he was speaking about the Māori land ownership at Wellington, described this as a few rude dwellings and some potato patches. And so in that way he was sort of trying to dismiss the claims to a much larger area of land and saying that Māori did not validly own those lands according to these notions that were derived from that wastelands theory, that you had to expend capital and labour on it to have a legitimate claim to ownership over it.
Can you talk to the complexity of iwi at the time? In the 1820s and 30s, there'd been a number of heke. What was happening for iwi?
Ngāti Toa and other iwi migrate south to the Cook Strait region from the early 1820s onwards, from Kawhia, Taranaki, and they obviously clash with resident iwi in the area, with Rangatane, Mo'opoko, Ngāti Apa, and through that time, by 1827, Te Raupaha also moves into Te Waipounamu, and again there are clashes with the resident Kurahopo iwi in the area, and by the early 1840s, in terms of customary rights, that's obviously contested between the different groups as to who has rights where. There are also at different times, at different places, clashes between some of the migrant groups, because it's also unclear between them as to the extent of their respective rights.
We've kind of dealt with the understanding around
Wairau?
Wairau at that point. We've got the 20 million land, got the big thing.
Yeah.
I guess
Should we get into the posse?
onto the posse
Yeah,
and
yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
What
so-
about the Kuika?
Oh,
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Because that would come
Let's
just
do that.
before.
okay.
Yes.
So, the Treaty of Waitangi had been signed in 1840. Te Rauparaha signed it twice. Māori would have started to be coming to terms with that kind of rule of law. What was happening, to the, how was the law playing out for Māori?
Well, a critical event happens late in 1842 when a Māori woman living in Cloudy Bay named Kuika is brutally raped and murdered along with her child. She's married to one of the European whalers. And the Māori wife of another whaler, Richard Cook, alleges that her husband is responsible for this. There's an uproar, but the local missionary Samuel Ironside convinces Ngāti Toa not to exact utu on Richard Cook, but to let the rule of law apply and justice will be done for all. So Cook is tried in the court in Wellington early in 1843, and it seems that there's an assumption that Cook and his wife are not legally married, but one of the first questions that happens in the court is to ask whether they were legally married, and it's divulged that they were. Under English common law at the time, a wife could not testify against her husband. Therefore, the case against Cook collapses because the Crown hasn't bothered to gather evidence from any of the many other Māori who could have testified that Cook was indeed the person who had brutally raped and murdered this woman. He walks free. For Ngāti Toa and other Māori, this is their their faith in the rule of law has been misplaced. And so this is kind of an example of where Ngāti Toa and other Māori kind of appeal to the Crown to apply the Article 3 rights in Te Tiriti, where Māori are guaranteed all the rights of British subjects. And in this case, that they don't get that justice that had been promised to them.
So Ngāti Toa loses a daughter and a mokopuna to murder, and justice doesn't prevail for them. How close is this, in terms of timing, is this close to the Wairau incident?
It is. The murder happens in December 1843. Cook is tried early in 1843. So this is just months really before the conflict takes place.
Yeah, would Te Rangi Haiata and Te Rau Paraha, would this be fresh in their minds?
It would have been very fresh to them, yes.
Talk to us about the posse. How did it come to be that they were going to get a group of people together to get around there?
So after the surveyors go back to Nelson and report, this huge area of valuable agricultural lands at Wairau, survey parties descend on the area from about April 1843. Ngāti Toa Rangatira makes several trips to Nelson to appeal to the company not to do this, not to survey their lands. They make it clear that they had never transacted these lands. To the extent that they understood the deed with the New Zealand Company, they understood that it only involved lands at Tasman Bay and perhaps Golden Bay, but certainly not Wairau. And so they're unequivocal about that. And these are brushed off. Their concerns are dismissed. A critical factor here is that the New Zealand Company doesn't have legal title to these lands. It doesn't own them, because when the Crown arrives in 1840, one of the very first things it does is to issue a proclamation that says all prior land transactions will be investigated by a Land Claims Commission, and if these are not upheld, the claims to land will be dismissed. The New Zealand Company's claims are subject to this. By early 1843, the process of investigating those claims hasn't been fulfilled. So Ngāti Toa, besides appealing to the New Zealand Company at Nelson, also appealed to William Spain, who's the Land Claims Commissioner responsible for investigating the company's claims. And they ask him, please come south and investigate, because the company is taking possession of our lands. We haven't sold our lands. We haven't transacted these lands. And Spain refuses. He says he'll come in time, but he's busy investigating the claims to the Port Nicholson block at Wellington. So by late May 1843, Ngāti Toa decide to go onto the lands. They start cultivating potatoes, which is evidence of ownership, even in those Pākehā terms, in terms of those wasteland theories. They also burn down some of the ropo whare that the surveyors have constructed on the lands, and they escort the surveyors off the lands in a non-violent manner, as even the surveyors themselves describe. The surveyors go back to Nelson early June 1843, report what's happened to them, and an arrest warrant is issued for arson for Te Raupaha and Te Rangi Haiata. And so that's really where what unfolds next starts to play out from.
So the New Zealand... So, despite the Crown at the time investigating, the New Zealand Company went against that ruling.
The New Zealand Company were effectively trespassing on lands that Ngāti Toa and other iwi laid claim to, and the company had no legal right to those lands.
And it was also under investigation by the Crown.
That's right, and someone like Henry Thompson, as the protector of Aborigines, if he was to do his job at this time, would have pointed out that the company did not own these lands. It had no right to survey them, and it was in fact trespassing on lands that were at that time still owned by Māori.
So the arrest warrant that was written out for Te Rau Paraha for burning down Raupō Whare on his own whenua was exactly what they needed to, give them the motivation, I guess, to go around.
The arrest warrant leads to the Henry Thompson, along with Arthur Wakefield, recruit a body of settlers, and many of them are labourers who have no idea where they're going, what they've been asked to do. So there's a group of 49 of them. They're not actually sworn in as special constables, contrary to what's said sometimes, so they have no legal authority, really. They're not acting on behalf of the Crown in that sense. They take the government brig Victoria, sail round to Cloudy Bay, and early in the morning of the 17th of June, they sail up the Wairau River. They drop their canoes off at the junction of the Tumarina stream and walk up the rest, and that's where they encounter Ngāti Toa.
Would they have, been well equipped?
Not really. I mean, a number of the men, especially some of the labourers, had probably never handled a firearm before and didn't have any particular skill in being able to use them. And compared with Ngāti Toa, who by this time had 2 decades of experience of use of firearms, they weren't really a match for Ngāti Toa.
Would they have, the people in the posse, would they have any idea who Te Rau Paraha and Te Rangi Haiata were?
I think some of them would. Thompson and Wakefield and so on had obviously had many dealings with Te Rau Paraha before, and so they would have known who he was. Some of the other men, I'm not sure. They may have, but for some of the men who didn't know where they were going, they didn't really fully understand the situation that they had been put in, and in fact the peril and the danger that they'd been placed in as a result.
And for Wakefield and Thompson, who did know Te Rau Paraha and Te Rangi Haiata and their position within Māori and within their iwi, were they underestimating the situation?
Extremely so. One of the factors that, as they're sailing south to Cloudy Bay, apparently the Europeans are in high spirits and they believe this will be straightforward. One of the factors that had led them to make that assumption was the previous year there'd been another dispute in Golden Bay where a rangatira had disputed Europeans accessing coal on lands that he believed were still his, that he hadn't sold or transacted. And in that case, the arrest of that rangatira had been fairly straightforward. And the assumption was this would apply here as well, but Te Rau Paraha and Te Rangi Haiata were, they were rangatira of a different stature, and they were not prepared to be placed in handcuffs and arrested and taken away and put in a jail and placed on trial. That was, a direct attack on their mana as rangatira of Ngāti Toa. And so there's this kind of clash of cultures in the sense that those Europeans seem to be tone deaf to what it is that they're doing and the likely reaction they'll get for that. This was never going to end well if they had insisted on that course of action.
It was the same magistrate, Thompson, who, the evidence shows that he punched a rangatira in the face to teach him a lesson. Did he take that same attitude to Te Rangi Haiata and Te Rau Paraha?
Thompson seems to have been quite contemptuous of these rangatira, and that combined with his volatile and hot-tempered manner, really, it was a recipe for disaster.
Talk us through when they arrived.
So they arrive at the site where Ngāti Toa are camped on one side of the Tumarina stream on the 17th of June. A waka is placed across the stream for Thompson and Wakefield and a small party of men to cross over to speak with them, while others remain behind on the other bank with their firearms at the ready. And Te Raupraha extends his hand to shake Henry Thompson's hand. Thompson brushes his hand away, which is the first signal that things are not going to go well. Thompson insists that Te Raupraha and Te Rangi Haiata surrender themselves and make themselves available to be arrested. Te Raupraha very patiently explains that he is waiting for William Spain, the Land Claims Commissioner, to come and sort all this out. There's been a misunderstanding. The land is his. He'd never sold it. Thompson becomes irate at this and, basically says that he's not there to argue. He's there to arrest them. He attempts to handcuff Te Raupraha. At this point, Te Rangi Haiata emerges, and he's quite angry about what he's witnessed, and he says that he hadn't gone to England to steal the land there. Why were they coming to his place to take his lands from him? And again makes clear that under no circumstances is he going to be arrested. Thompson threatens to fire on Ngāti Toa if the rangatira did not make their submission. And the second time that he attempts to handcuff Te Raupraha, Te Raupraha brushes him away. At that point, there are disputing versions of what took place, but some say that Thompson had ordered his men on the other side of the stream to come forward and fire. And what we do know is that gunfire broke out. Te Rongo, the wife of Te Rangi Haiata, is killed, along with at least 3 others, possibly as many as 9 Māori killed. And this is really the start of the gunfire and exchange.
So with the recent injustice, legal injustice fresh in their minds, what took place next?
So it soon becomes evident that Ngāti Toa have the upper hand. The European party scramble back to the other side of the Tumarina stream and up the steep hill there, trying to sort of flee from the scene once it becomes clear that they're overwhelmed. After a while, they make their submission, and Arthur Wakefield, Henry Thompson, and a group of others are taken prisoner. And then there's a debate really about their fate. And Te Raupraha...
What would they have expected, do you think, Wakefield and Thompson? They were the rangatira really in the Pākehā world of Nelson. What would they have expected to have happened to them?
I think if they were applying, say, European rules of warfare as they were understood at the time, they might have assumed that their surrender would mean that they were taken prisoner and eventually freed somehow.
And what did happen to them?
Well, Te Raupraha asked for at least a gentleman to be spared. Te Rangi Haiata's wife has been killed in the exchange of gunfire, and he demands uti for this. And Te Raupraha really knows that he can't stand in his way because Te Rangi Haiata has tikanga on his side. In the wide view of things, Ngāti Toa are camped there on their own lands when this posse turns up, attacks them, kills their wives and family, and Ngāti Toa are there. there are women, children, as well as men, many of them unarmed. It's not a toa that they have there. They're simply camped on their own land, so to be attacked and killed in those circumstances is, something that is, Te Rangi Hayata is greatly angered by that, and he demands utu, and eventually Te Rauparaha realises that he's in no position to prevent that, and so the men are executed, 9 of them, one by one, with a mere.
Tell me why, what does the mere rather than the gun signify? He could have easily just shot them all dead.
I guess that placed the killings in a customary context than would have been the case had a firearm been used.
And what was the reaction back in Nelson when they'd heard that their brothers and their fathers and their sons had been killed?
Well, there's huge anger, and there are demands for retribution. And one of the issues at this time is that Governor Hobson had died, and the country is waiting for his successor, Robert Fitzroy, to arrive. And he doesn't come until the end of the year, so all eyes are kind of on how is this new governor going to respond to the situation. Will he seek vengeance for what is seen as the massacre of these settlers, or will he deal with the situation in a different way? And nobody's quite sure of the answer to that until Fitzroy arrives and makes clear his response. Some
of the paper clippings we still have, access to today, how was it reported back then?
It's described as a bloodthirsty, savage, barbaric massacre of law-abiding settlers. Interestingly enough, there are some counter voices, even amongst Europeans. One of the surveyors, John Barnicott, says afterwards that, on balance, that he felt that the situation was the one that the Europeans were to blame for, and that many people thought that Thompson's actions had contributed no end to this outcome as well. That was obvious that his volatile and angry actions on that day, his disregard for tikanga, for protocol, for the murder of these rangatira had contributed enormously to what unfolded.
Some survived though, so how did they survive?
Yeah, of the party of 49, 27 survived. They make their way back to Nelson about 10 days later. There are some suggestions that some of the Ngāti Toa may have assisted them to escape, and especially Rauri Puaha, who was a Christian rangatira from the area, who was there, but who didn't take part in the killings and who appears to have called for moderation.
Ironside, the Christian minister, was he? Yeah, was there a follow-up there?
Yeah, Ironside comes across the grisly scene afterwards and buries the bodies of the Europeans.
And there were some interesting finds. Under tikanga Māori, they had placed the bodies in certain ways.
Yeah, I think it was Arthur Wakefield who had a loaf of bread placed under his head, which was a sort of a sign of contempt that he was, suggesting the consumption of Wakefield.
How did the Wairau, shape things to come in the colony?
It had massive ramifications, not just for Ngāti Toa, but for all of the iwi really in the Cook Strait region who claimed some form of customary rights. So what unfolds is that when Fitzroy arrives, he meets with Te Rauparaha, another Ngāti Toa, in February 1844, and after listening to their testimony, he declares that the New Zealand Company and the settlers were responsible for what had happened at Wairau in June 1843, that he says that the killing of the prisoners was unfortunate, but under the circumstances their passions were up, they were angry about what had taken place, so he could forgive them for that. And that was quite a bold response in the circumstances because
How did the settlers? Was he at odds with the settlers and the township?
there's enormous anger at Fitzroy's response. The settlers feel that he has abandoned them. They feel that he is condoning what they saw as a massacre, and there are calls for Fitzroy to be replaced and for a new governor to arrive and so on. And so there's uproar really about this, and later on when Fitzroy does eventually depart as governor, the settlers burn effigies of him in celebration.
Te Rauparaha and Te Rangi Haiata, you know, in a sense, they won that day, but it was a bit of a hollow victory, wasn't it?
Yeah, things change again when in 1845 Fitzroy is replaced by Governor George Grey, and Grey takes a completely different attitude towards Wairau, and he says Ngāti Toa were to blame for that, and he demands that they pay utu for this, and what he asks for is that they hand over the Wairau as payment for the Europeans who are killed. In 1846, you have war breaking out in the Wellington region. Again, Te Rangi Haiata is a key player in those events. He evades capture, but Te Rauparaha, who is alleged without foundation really to also be behind what takes place there, is kidnapped, placed on a hulk, eventually sent to Auckland and held under a kind of house arrest with Te Whero. So Ngāti Toa lose their senior rangatira. In his absence, Grey pushes through a land deal for Wairau, 600,000 acres of lands acquired for £3,000. So that deed is signed in March 1847 by three rangatira, including Tamihana Te Rauparaha, all in the absence of his father, and that really they're pressured into that. At the same time, lands at Porirua are also acquired in this way. So, and those transactions have implications for all of the other iwi who claim interest in those lands. In terms of the Northern South Island, a series of deeds are later signed between 1853 and 1856 with various other iwi, but they're told they don't have an option whether they wish to retain or sell their lands. The lands have already been sold. It's simply a question of, do you want some compensation for your interest in these? Under the circumstances, they do sign those deeds, but their lands are gone. So yeah, this has implications for all Māori throughout the region.
When you say kidnapped Te Rauparaha, you know, why do you say kidnapped and not arrested?
Well, there's no legal process that's applied in the situation. Te Rauparaha is never charged with anything. He's held without trial. You know, the right of habeas corpus that would usually be applied to somebody who was alleged to have committed a crime, where they appear before a court to hear the formal charges against them. They're not applied in this situation. And what happens to Te Rauparaha alarms rangatira throughout the country, because if one of the great rangatira throughout Aotearoa can be treated in this way, then there's nothing to stop the Crown doing the same to any other rangatira, and it causes enormous alarm.
So they kidnap Te Rauparaha and go after Te Rangi Haiata.
Yeah, so Te Rangi Haiata during the Wellington War in 1846, which is again, the issues in contention in Wellington are very similar. It's about contested New Zealand Company claims to land and mana whenua, saying that we have not sold these lands, and the way that Grey responds to that is that he declares martial law. He sends in the army. The Hutt Valley is the homes of Māori living there are looted and ransacked. They're forced off those lands at gunpoint. Conflict takes place at Bulcott's Farm in May 1846. In August, Te Rangi Haiata is pursued up Battle Hill by a force of British troops and some of their colonial and Māori allies. He evades capture and makes his way to the Manawatu, where he continues really to resist Crown authority for the rest of his life and to be a strong advocate for Ngāti Toa. But Grey, through his actions in the Wellington War, does enough to impose his authority over that district. And really what he's trying to do with the kidnapping and capture of Te Raupaha is to eliminate what he views as the main rival centre of authority to his power and his authority.
Explain how a military road was built from Wellington to Porirua.
I'm not sure on the details on the timing of that, but what I do know is that Māori quickly came to understood that roads were not always benign, that they could be used to transport troops to places where Māori lived, and so Rangatira quite quickly develop a sense of the strategic significance of the roads, that they're not simply something that's useful for carting produce to market, but they can also, troops can also use them to march to war.
What's your observations around the history, how it's been framed? I mean, we asked this question about Te Rangi Haiata and Te Rauparaha. Ngāti Toa talks about how their legacies have been tarnished by the Crown and continue to have been. What do you think about the way that they've been framed in history?
Well, I think you can kind of see that in terms of even what we describe this as, and for a long time for Pākehā it was known as the Wairau Massacre. Tuamarina Cemetery was referred to as Massacre Hill, and well into the late 20th century it's still really described in those ways. Later on, I guess there's more understanding that there's a different version of the story, somewhat softer terms such as the Freudian incident and so on are used, but I think there's still, if you look at the signage at the site, it doesn't really convey the Ngāti Toa side of that story, or that there's a wider context to what took place here than simply the events of that day. And you can't understand Wairau without understanding that full context, the competing understandings of these land transactions, the New Zealand company, its motivation, the way it viewed Māori with contempt, Thompson and his actions and so on. These are all factors that contribute to this, a tragic sequence of events that take place at Wairau.
How would you frame it?
I'm not sure that I have a particular term that I would use, but I would probably refer to it as a Wairau clash or something like that. One of the interesting questions is in terms of, is what took place at Wairau in June 1843 the start of the New Zealand Wars or not? One of the issues with that is that it's a one-off clash rather than the start of a war, although it does have its legacies really and parallels in what takes place in the Wellington region. But I do think it is part of a wider sequence of conflict, and in that way it is definitely part of the story of the New Zealand Wars. James Belch, I think, famously described Wairau as the first and last settler commando party ever in New Zealand history, and I think that's also quite a nice way of describing it.
Well, it was only a few years on, and then Ruapekapeka took place, so it was happening at both ends of the country, right?
Yeah, and what takes place at Wairau is replicated in the north in the mid-1840s, and then obviously you have the main sequence of the wars through the 1860s as well.
What is the legacy of Wairau?
Well, I think for Ngāti Toa and for the other iwi who feel its repercussions in various ways, it's quite tragic because they lose large areas of very valuable lands. There's also those killed at Wairau itself, and also the tarnishing of their rangatira and their reputations over time through history, and so it has repercussions that resonate over time, really.
What became of their Wairau lands?
Well, the Wairau lands today, many of them are covered in vineyards, and they obviously generate enormous wealth for the owners of those properties. I think Wairau is really a precursor of the conflicts and the troubles ahead in terms of these two competing understandings of the nature of the relationship between Māori and Pākehā, where rangatira like Te Raupaha and others thought that they entered into a partnership, a mutually beneficial relationship, and many of the Europeans come here with these kind of Victorian assumptions of racial hierarchy where they are dominant and Māori are beneath them, and they attempt to make that idea a reality, and that's a fruit of many of these conflicts, along with obviously the tensions over land and authority and sovereignty and rangatiratanga and so on. It all go to the heart of these conflicts, and you can see those issues also in the Wairau conflict in 1843.
Māori at the time, were diligent in their stories and accounts of their land and the transfers and the deals that didn't happen. Te Rauparaha also presented to the Land Commission. What did he tell them?
Well, Te Rauparaha insisted that he'd never sold Wairau. He says when he meets with Governor Fitzroy in February 1844, he says that land is the root of all of these problems. The Europeans say it's theirs, but who says so besides them? And he then sets out that the Ngāti Toa understanding that the lands that had been transacted included Tasman Bay and maybe Golden Bay, but certainly not Wairau, and also outlines the steps that they'd taken to appeal really to the rule of law for an investigation into the ownership of those lands to avoid trouble. They had pleaded with William Spain to come and investigate the claims. They had been to Nelson and appealed to the New Zealand Company and explained that they still owned the lands, that the lands didn't belong to the company. They had calmly told the surveyors that they weren't welcome on their lands and so on. And really he painted quite a compelling picture of the steps that Ngāti Toa had taken to avoid trouble, and then the series of events on that day that had led to bloodshed, including the outbursts of anger by Thompson that had created that had led to this violent exchange that had not been something that Ngāti Toa had sought or even expected. When the Europeans arrived, he talks about how at first he thought it might be William Spain at last coming to investigate the ownership of those lands, as they'd pleaded for him to do. So, that Fitzroy, I think, hearing the testimony of Te Raupaha and others, finds this compelling, and he finds that the New Zealand Company were in the wrong, which they were, because they did not have legal title to those lands. They weren't owners of the lands. They were trespassing on lands that belonged to Ngāti Toa and other Māori.